بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله سيدنا محمد وصحبه وبارك وسلم. Our sponsors, OCAF South Africa, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Sometimes technology is not your friend. I'm going to sort of take a slightly different approach because I see some faces that were in the mosque earlier on today, but I will still flesh out some of the main characteristics of the life and times of Tuan Guru, because the book that we have just completed is not just about Tuan Guru himself, it's also about the life and the times and the context of his life. One thing that I've been telling media since the launch of the book is that I feel quite strongly now that Tuan Guru should in fact be declared a national hero. He needs to be remembered along the likes of our forgotten heroes, people like Robert Sobukwe, Steve Biko, and many others who have made such a contribution to the landscape that is South Africa today. Tuan Guru's story, it's a very long one, and I'm going to make it fairly brief. I'm also quite keen to answer any questions if you have any questions to ask. There's no guarantee I have the answers, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to do that. Tuan Guru is a word that means master teacher. I'm sure we've all heard of the word guru. He's a guru at this, he's a guru at social media sometimes, or whatever the case may be. Tuan Guru's full name is Imam Abdullah ibn Qadi Abdus Salam. He was a son of Qadi Abdus Salam, who was a fully qualified scholar, religious judge, and royal ambassador to the house of Tidore. Tuan Guru hailed from one of the Spice Islands in Indonesia. It was very famous for its cloves, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, cloves had the same value of gold. Cloves were used for flavoring food. It could be used as an antiseptic. It had a lot of qualities that was very useful to the world at that time. So it meant that as Europe rose from the Middle Ages, remembering that this was a Europe at the time of Islamic civilization where the kings of Europe couldn't even sign their names when the streets of cities such as Seville and Baghdad actually had street lights. Tuan Guru in Tidore hailed from a royal family, and he also hails from a lineage that is prophetic. And we have traced his forefathers from Baghdad all the way to Hadramawt, to Oman, to India, and then to places such as China, Cambodia, Thailand, and then Indonesia. A lot of people forget that the ancestors of Tuan Guru, the Ba'alawi, from Hadramawt, from Yemen, introduced Islam to places like Thailand. Thailand is 40-50% Muslim. They don't tell us this. Cambodia had Islam from the earliest days of Islam, as did China. And some of his ancestors were responsible for the spread of Islam. Now, how did Tuan Guru get to Tidore in the first place? His one ancestor is a man called Sunan Gunung Jati, Sharif Hidayatullah, who was one of the founding saints of Indonesia. They call him the Wali Songo. Now, the interesting thing about Sunan Gunung Jati is that he became the Sultan of a place called Cirebon and a place called Banten, two kingdoms on the island of Java. One of Sunan Gunung Jati's descendants Habib Umar Rahmat al-Faruq, traveled to Tidore in 1646 to perform da'wah, to spread the word of Islam. Tidore has been a sultanate for over 900 years, but until the 17th century, Islam had just been confined to the coastal region. Tidore is a volcanic island. The volcano in Tidore is twice the height of Table Mountain, so it's a very high volcano. So the idea was to spread Islam to the tribes living inland of the island of Tidore. In the late 1700s, the Dutch arrived looking for cloves. They tried to colonize Tidore, but not with great success. So they would enter into some very uneasy commercial arrangements with the sultans of the Spice Islands. Now, why do I say this? We have to remember, and I've been emphasizing this all along, Indonesia is not a part of the ocean where you have a lot of islands and people sitting under coconut trees waiting for them to fall. No. Indonesia, historically, has been a place of great civilization. Very few people realize that on the island of Java are the remains of one of the biggest pyramids in the world. It is much, much bigger than the Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, and nobody knows who built it or where it came from, but it's there. So what Tuan Guru brought to South Africa, apart from his Islam, was a civilization. And this has been a big challenge in trying to rewrite our history, because the colonial historians seem to think that we all were a bunch of naked savages for some strange reason, when the opposite is actually the truth. And the truth of the matter is that Tuan Guru and his people did not see themselves at any stage as inferior to the colonialists. This is something that has been forgotten in the sweep of African history. When the colonialists arrived here, they confronted not people living in mud huts, they confronted civilizations. Because people built great buildings from mud doesn't mean to say that they are inferior to somebody who built something from brick. So this is all the background to Tuan Guru's story. The Dutch arrive and they do their best to try and disrupt life in Indonesia, because of course what happened was the Sultan had started to rebel. The royal families did not like being colonized, so there was an ongoing rebellion in Indonesia which saw nearly 200 emirs, princes, royal courtiers, scholars and sheikhs being exiled to the Cape from 1658 to 1793. In Tuan Guru's case, what happened was that the English were making their presence felt in the Southeast Asia. They had landed in India looking for tea, and they were about to wipe out the Indian civilization, the Mughal civilization, and they were coming further south into the Philippines and into the Spice Islands. A diplomatic mission was sent from the Sultan of Tidore to find out what this Englishman was doing in a place called Balabanga, where he put up a warehouse. The Dutch saw this as a betrayal of Dutch interests and decided to act against the royal family of Tidore. So what they did, they exiled the Sultan and his two sons to Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, together with Tuan Guru, another man called Qadi Abdurrauf, another man called Nurul Iman, another man called Badruddin. They were all royal courtiers, they were scribes, they were very highly qualified, highly ranked officials in the government of Tidore. They spent some time in Batavia, which was a hellhole. I did some research on Batavia at the time of when Tuan Guru was there, and discovered that the Dutch had come and tried to create Amsterdam in the tropics. Okay, that's crazy, isn't it? The canals became filled with crocodiles that used to eat people. There were mosquitoes, there was typhoid, and there was disease, there was malaria. So in other words, anybody that would come to Batavia had a 50% chance of dying in the first 6 months. And this is not what colonial history tells us. It tells us it's a beautiful city with nice trees. Sorry, not the case. Tuan Guru survives all of this. But after about 8 months, he is told by the governor in Batavia that he is going to be sent to the Cape Colony. Now you can imagine in those days, nobody even knew where the tip of Africa was because it was so far away. I mean, it would take 70 days to sail from Batavia to Cape Town, and another 70 days to sail to Amsterdam. It was a long trip, it was a long journey. So he's put in the ship and he arrives in Cape Town. No family, no books, very few clothes, nothing. He's basically left with the clothing on his back, and he arrives in Cape Town in April. Now imagine you come from the tropics all the way to a place like Cape Town. The weather is different, the culture is different, the food is different, everything is different. And also the weather. It's like us in Durban being sent to go to the Antarctic, because in April in Cape Town it can be extremely cold. So he experiences the coldest weather of his life. The southeast is blowing, it's raining. And he arrives in Cape Town and the colonial authorities don't have his papers. His papers are on another ship. So they don't know what to do. So for them, the most convenient thing is to send them to Robben Island. So Tuan Guru and his 3 other colleagues are sent to Robben Island. They stay on Robben Island for a year. And then the English arrive. The Commodore Johnson, the English now want to try and take over the Cape. The Dutch go into a flat panic and they sail their ships to Saldanha Bay to try and hide them from the English, and they take the political exiles with them because they cannot afford to let the political exiles mix with the slave and free black population because they might cause problems. And when I was doing the book, we actually discovered a letter that Tuan Guru had written to Tidore. For some reason it wasn't delivered, and I found it in a house in Cape Town and we got it translated. It's very interesting because he talks about his family, he passes greetings to all his family, and it's very moving when you read this more than 200 years later to see how he was so homesick. His wife was there, his children were there, his sons, his cousins, his aunts and his uncles, and he greets them all. And the letter is in the book. But then he goes on to talk about his incarceration on Robben Island and what happens after that. And it gets interesting because he says after a year, and he calls the Dutch the unbelievers, he says the unbelievers panicked because the British were coming, and he was taken to Saldanha Bay. In Saldanha Bay, the Dutch are not very successful in hiding away because the British arrive and blow the Dutch fleet into the water. What is interesting is that I found a diary, well, the logbook of Commodore Johnson, which agrees with Tuan Guru's account, that 2 of Tuan Guru's colleagues, Qadi Abdul Rauf, who was a royal ambassador, and Nurul Iman, who was a scribe, get into a boat and they go to the British ship and they are taken away from the Cape. Tuan Guru also mentions that because the ships had been sunk and because there was no Uber in those days, he had to walk 15 days in the miserable Cape winter weather all the way back to Cape Town. So you could just imagine the hardship. While he was on the island, he did something quite amazing. He was a Hafiz al-Quran. He was a genuine scholar. He wrote the Quran from memory because he realized from the very beginning that the convicts on Robben Island, the slaves on Robben Island, the population of Robben Island needed comfort, they needed spiritual advice. And the best way that he could do it, the best way he could start doing it, was to have the Quran. He spends from 1781 to 1786 in Cape Town, and then something happens in Cape Town. Some of the convicts have served their term, and they ask the governor, can they please go home? And the Dutch, being such kindly people, say, no, you can't go home. One of the ex-convicts he ran amok. In fact, the word amok is actually an old Indonesian word which means to express your anger. And he ran amok, and he killed people in the streets. Now we have to be careful how we understand this, and this is how critical it is to decolonize our understanding of history. Why did this man, Surabrata, do this? He did it, number one, he'd lost face. One of the most important things about the culture of Southeast Asia, we call it face, is dignity. They are a very, very dignified people. This man had lost his dignity. He was angry. He had no future. It was a glorified suicide mission. He wanted the authorities to kill him. They didn't kill him in the beginning, because what they did was they captured him and they cut his hand off, and as he was dying they beat him in the face with his hand. Welcome to the Dutch. Now, as a result of this, the Dutch decided to put all the exiles back on Robben Island again. So you can imagine, in 1786, Tuan Guru goes back onto the island until 1791. It's not often that you hear of people going onto Robben Island once, but twice, that's a lot. And remember, in those days, the conditions were so bad that there's evidence of another king who was on Robben Island complaining that he didn't even have a light in his cell on Robben Island. That's how bad his conditions were. So you can imagine what these people are going through. But through all of this, Tuan Guru, he keeps his dignity. He then writes a 600-page compendium of dhikrs, of hadith, of fiqh, of tawheed, of how to understand Allah, to be used as a teaching guide for the community of Cape Town. Now, why am I saying all the time he should be declared a national hero? And I spoke about this at the mosque earlier today. Tuan Guru did something very unique in the history of South Africa before we even knew about certain concepts. In 1793, he sees there's a great need for education, education, and education. His method of resistance was not to pull out a gun or a crossbow or a sword, because the Dutch would have slaughtered him in 30 seconds. That would have been a wasted endeavor, and there were uprisings against the Dutch, which they put down very cruelly. So he thought, let me free the mind. And he did it by education. And the biggest ethos of the sheikhs that came from Indonesia to the Cape, they taught the people, your body might be in chains, but your soul and your minds are free. Now, the school that he established in 1793 started off with about 200 to 300 pupils. And in the 1820s, his madrasa had about nearly 500 students. His school had 500 students after his death, when the newly formed University of Cape Town couldn't boast 26 graduates. This is the impact of his education. But the school itself is interesting. It was open to all, no strings attached, but it was directed at the slave, ex-convict, and free black population. Now, a free black in those days was a person who was a slave that had been freed, or somebody that had come as a laborer, and they were now starting to establish themselves socially, although they were regarded as third-class citizens. So the school was open to everybody. And what we have to remember is that the community of Cape Town in those days consisted of slaves who came from, and I'll go through the list, from Madagascar. They came from Sri Lanka. They came from the Coromandel and the Bengali coasts. They came from Kerala, from India. They came from Bengal, which is modern-day Bangladesh. They came from Africa, from the Swahili coast, from East Africa. I actually believe that the so-called Mozambican slaves, many of them could have come from Malawi even. They came from West Africa. And they came from many other parts of the world, Malaysia and Indonesia. So what have we got here? We've got like a United Nations in this one school. What Tuan Guru did was, he created the Rainbow Nation from Bishop Desmond Tutu a long time before we even knew it was going to be a word. He created what we would call non-racial education before we even knew it existed in this country, at his school. And that to me is something that I think we need to remember, because there's a lesson in this for us today, I think. The unconditional acceptance of people for whoever they were. Welcome, you come to my school, I educate you. There's lessons to be learned from this. He also was a pioneer of the Quranic tradition. In fact, he ended up writing 5 Qurans from memory. And they were used in the community for many years. In fact, the family members have got copies of these Qurans, which unfortunately they are not prepared to release to the public. It's another jihad that we're conducting at the moment. He was also an educator, he was a comforter, he was a spiritual healer. And a lot of people say in Afrikaans, it's tukum, it's witchcraft. No. In those days, there were no orthodox doctors. There were no doctors for slaves. The Dutch, they didn't care. You know, if you die, you die. So the learned people had to act as healers. And this is where it gets interesting. I haven't written about it much in the book, but I'm discovering more and more the intimate relationship that the early Muslim community had with the Khoi, or the Hu, which is a more correct pronunciation of them. The Khoi showed the Indonesian healers the local herbs in the fynbos in Cape Town to use for healing. An example of this is somebody called Paiskapi. He's buried at a place called the town of Baru in Cape Town, and he used to grow aloes. Now, a lot of us who understand cattle, people mulch up the aloes and they feed it to cattle, and Paiskapi used to look after animals, but the aloes were also used as medicine for humans, and you can still see those aloes today in Cape Town, in the town of Baru, where he lies buried. So can you see all these interesting dynamics going on under the leadership of people like Tuan Guru, who would encourage this because the people had no doctors. And what Tuan Guru also did was he acted as a spiritual healer as well. His other great contribution was that he established the first mosque in Cape Town. I was going to talk about it tonight, but it's a whole issue because it gives us graphic proof of the racism against the early Muslim community, where the governor of the Cape would give a letter and say you can build a mosque, and the police officials would raid the houses of the Muslims and steal the letters so they would not have a letter of authority to build the mosque. And this happened on numerous occasions, and we have proof of this. Or the governor of the Cape would say, can you please discuss it? He would go to the Burger Senate. Can you please discuss the issue? The Burger Senate would refuse to even discuss the issue of building a mosque. They had so little respect for the community. I can carry on going on forever, but forever isn't the amount of time that we have this evening. I thank you very much for coming out here in some Cape Town style weather. I've really enjoyed talking to you. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. No guarantees I have the answers, but shukran. Thank you very much for your patience.
Jazakallah, thank you very much, Brother Shafiq Morton, for that wonderful explanation. And I'm sure it must have been an inspiring and worthwhile journey to delve into the life of Tuan Guru, and we're indebted for you to having brought this information through to us, so that we just need to access a book to get all of this information. And I know the hard work you must have done in trying to research and put all of that together. And you know, I'm a school principal by day, and I know that reading isn't the first thing that comes to mind for many of our children and members of our community. In fact, they say if you don't read a lot, you have very little to talk about and nothing to think about. And I hope, inshallah, that this book, as well as many other books, find its way into our homes, and the culture of reading for ourselves as adults and our children becomes alive, inshallah. So what we intend doing very quickly is I'm going to ask Professor Suleiman Dango just to respond to Brother Shafiq Morton's presentation. And perhaps Brother Muhammad Amra will say a few words. And then if you have any questions, we'll open the floor for any questions. So maybe you should just make a note of some of the things you'd like to ask about, and we'll take it from there, inshallah. It gives me a great pleasure to call on Professor Suleiman Dango to respond.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's a great honor for me to meet Shafiq. It's a pleasure and an honor. And of course, I didn't realize that our relationship goes back very long. Our first contact goes back very long ago. Last century, right? Okay, yeah. There was a meeting at Osman Masjid. I'm not sure they remember. It was just to plan a trip to Palestine. I couldn't remember who was there. I know Muhammad Dan was one of the organizers. I think Abi Dawaji was there. I can't remember the rest. One day I was Googling, and I came across one of our cousins, Jewish cousins, newspapers or newsletters. And lo and behold, I see the names of the people who were in the Bosman Mosque, and Shafiq's name was there. And this was after like 30 years or so, right? Somebody in that group of about 10 actually reported the meeting. I just want to, so you know what was going on actually in the past. Okay, I think first of all, the surah that Hafiz Shoaib read, or parts of the surah, I think is very, very relevant. I'm not sure whether it was done intentionally, but this is Surah Fatih. And it starts, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. The occasion of revelation is the intention of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba to go for Umrah. And they were blocked at a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside Makkah. And of course, many Sahaba the Makkans came out to block them. Many Sahaba insisted on going in, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no, let's negotiate. And then they had negotiation and drew up a truce of Hudaybiyah. And many of the Sahaba were very upset, and they said, they can't stop us, how can they stop us from going in? The surah was revealed. Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. That this was actually a victory, because they could return the year later. So I think why this is so appropriate is, when we look at the Muslims who arrived at the Cape, they faced the same type of obstacles. But they were very resilient. They didn't give up. And they made their way in, they established themselves there, consolidated Islam, and then of course Islam grew from there. So I think it's a very appropriate verses that Shoaib has actually recited here. Now, the impact of scholars, and of course what in Islamic terminology is called awliya, all right? And of course the great ulama, and so the impact is usually known when there are legends attached to them. And Shafiq has mentioned some of them in the book. So I hope you can buy the book so you can read about the legends. The legends are actually miracles. Now, whether they actually occurred or not, I think it's not relevant. I think Shafiq says that. But important thing is, the legends are proof that that particular person, whether it's called a wali or whatever, is highly respected, venerated. And this is the case with Tuan Guru. And of course, you know, here we call them mazars. In the Cape, they are called karamat. And the word karamat in Arabic means a miracle. It means a miracle. So miracles are attached to these people. And I think one of the miracles is that after over a century, when people go to the Cape, they will still go to the Bokab and go and visit the karamat of Tuan Guru, and they will go to, of course, Furi, the karamat of Shaykh Yusuf. I have to go there because I wrote the book on Shaykh Yusuf. So I'm obliged to go there. But the point is that, you know, the fact that there are legends attached to them just indicates the veneration in which they are held by people. The title, of course, of the book, From the Spice Islands to Cape Town. I was going to say, sugar and spice and all things nice. You know the song. Now, why do you think I'm saying sugar and spice? Anybody can guess why? Why sugar and spice?
The indentured laborers came in the sugar plantations.
Sorry?
The indentured laborers came in the sugar plantations.
Slave labor.
Sorry, is it about sugar plantation?
The indentured laborers.
Right. And spice?
Slave.
Right.
Slave.
This is amazing how Islam has spread throughout the world. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, we don't want to go into the story of New Zealand, but if you look at what happened after New Zealand, it's absolutely amazing. The Muslims here, of course, together with the indentured laborers, came to Natal. They were brought here because of sugar cane. The Muslims in Cape Town came because of spices. And of course, when they came to Cape Town, they were going to, you know, stop in Cape Town because they thought Chauhans and Haribais were there. And they didn't find him, so they had to travel all the way to the east. All right, now, I think just want to talk about the approach of history, and I think Shafiq has alluded to this, not in detail, but is mentioned, I think it's very important. On page 11 of the book, what it says here is, this is because we are not just talking about a purely dateline history, but rather about a communally sacrosanct narrative. It is a narrative cultivated by oral tradition, passed from generation to generation. It informs the culture, it comforts in its moment of stress, and it acts as its beacon of hope. Because what has happened in the past, I think before the 1940s, most of the research was always, you know, based on documents, on literature. So you look at newspapers, wills, minutes of meetings, brochures, pamphlets, all of those things. But after 1948, around 1950, the oral tradition, oral history became very, very important. Because what they found is documents will give you history, events and dates and so on. But those events actually involve people, human beings. When Jan van Riebeeck, for instance, landed at the Cape, we know that he came, that's the information. He came to the Cape, it was 1652, that's information. You can get from the documents. But do we know how he felt when he landed at the Cape? Did he say, wow, when he saw Table Mountain? Did he feel elated? Did he feel depressed? You're not going to get that from documents. So the only way you can get people's feelings and emotions and thoughts is by personal interaction. And that's why oral history has become so important today in research. That you actually meet people, and of course, Mikhail spoke about this lady. How else would you have known about the manuscript or the documents she had of Tuan Guru? Because you went to meet her personally. So lots of information you will not find in documents. You'll find it by meeting people because they have with them in the archives something which they have kept. In fact, today, Hassanain brought a box to, from Hanif, from Al-Jamaa party, containing the documents because he's actually the founder of the Muslim Student Association. And I'm busy writing a book. So he sent me these documents, which of course nobody else has. So through interaction, you are going to get information, either supplementing what you find in documents or completely new information. But you are dealing with people. What we want is lived experience of people. And I think Shafiq has brought this into the book. We see Tuan Guru, and we see him as a human being, not just a name, but as a human being lived at a certain time through our history and the impact that he has made. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of the Moluccas. I mean, Shafiq has detailed that in the book. There's quite a bit of it. But I think what's important is when we are trying to understand a personality, it's very important to know the context in which they live, to know the environment, the social environment, the political environment, the economic environment. Because that is what's going to shape his or her mind. That will shape his or her worldview. That will shape his or her behavior and conduct. And so, when Tuan Guru is coming now all over to the Cape, he's already come with a mindset. He's already come with some kind of a worldview. In addition to that, when he comes to Cape Town, he's also going to bring his traditions there. How did we find Malay traditions in the Cape? Because the people from Indonesia and Malaysia brought them to the Cape. So migration, of course, brings in, and I'll speak to you later about the issue of Malay, which Shafiq already alluded to earlier on. Now, the Cape, again, so when he arrives to the Cape, now we see Tuan Guru. So Shafiq brings us now to the Cape. Well, who did he find the Cape? Inhabitants, the colonialists. First was the Dutch, and then came the British. Then you got the Khoi and the San. We don't know very much about the interaction between the Muslims and the Khoi and the San, right? Okay. Yeah, we don't know very much. But we do know with the slaves. And so we have the Dutch, the colonizers, we have the Khoi and the San, we have the slaves, we have the political exiles, we have the scholars, and we have even criminals. All of these are now inhabitants of Cape. So he comes into that particular context. And of course, Shafiq, of course, as a good writer, and as he himself has said, this is not just about Tuan Guru. It is about Tuan Guru, but not only about Tuan Guru, because he weaves in a whole lot of other issues through the story of Tuan Guru. And one of them is the issue of colonization. And colonizers, wherever they go, they do basically the same thing. They oppress the people, they exploit them economically, and they treat them very, very harshly. And I will just quote from the book here about economic exploitation. He encountered the locals, but things went sour shortly after he had bartered for 2 sheep and a cow by handing over some mirrors, glass beads, and a baby's rattle. This was called barter. And I remember when I was young also once upon a time. And I saw this movie, I saw this film where they show Jan van Riebeeck landing at the Cape, and he's taking a sheep from the San people and giving them a mirror. And some people thought this was actually a bargain, because they didn't know about the rand-dollar exchange at the time. So, but this is the way the bartering actually took place. So there was economic exploitation. And of course, the torture, Shafiq has alluded to that, of the slaves, it was incredible. They were broken at the wheel and so on. And then of course, also racism. I mean, these people who came to the Cape obviously thought that they were superior to everyone else, and so they could actually treat them the way they wished. And so again, just one line from the book where said the European notion of racial superiority based on mercantile affluence and religious bigotry made it impossible for the visitors to accept the Khoi as equals. And this is what colonizers have done throughout the world. Okay, sorry. Now, just coming quickly now to Islam at the Cape. So this was the environment in which he found himself. Now what you need to know is from the time the Muslims landed at the Cape, for 150 years, they were not allowed to express Islam in public. So the first madrasa only came around 1793, and that was established by Tuan Guru. So the first madrasa in South Africa, by Tuan Guru, 1793. First masjid, also by Tuan Guru. The dates, I just spoke to Shafiq earlier, there's a dispute about the exact date. So some people go to 1797, 1804, but it doesn't matter. This was over 150 years. So I would say that Tuan Guru, maybe Sheikh Yusuf, you could say, is a spiritual father, but Tuan Guru